After my stroke left me partially paralyzed, I moved in with my son, who said money didn't matter and he'd care for me always. But as months passed, his resentment grew with every meal I ate and every medication I needed. Last Thursday at dinner, while I was eating slowly with my trembling hands, my son exploded and told me to stop eating because I was wasting food that cost him money I wasn't contributing. What I did next made him come begging on his knees outside my door. Before I tell you what I did, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so more people hear this story. 2 years ago, I suffered a severe stroke while living alone in my small apartment. Woke up one morning with the entire left side of my body not responding properly, and my speech slurred beyond recognition. Managed to call emergency services before losing consciousness. Spent 3 weeks in the hospital, followed by 2 months in rehabilitation, learning to walk again and regain basic functions. The stroke left me with permanent partial paralysis on my left side. My hand trembled constantly, making simple tasks like eating and dressing difficult. My mobility was limited, requiring a cane for balance and support. My doctor explained I could no longer live independently without significant help, that I needed someone to assist with daily tasks like cooking and cleaning and managing medications, that living alone posed serious safety risks given my condition. Had modest savings of about $40,000 accumulated over my lifetime of work, enough to cover maybe a year of professional care, but not the long-term assistance I'd need. My son Kevin offered immediately to have me move in with him and his family, said I was his father, and of course they'd take care of me in my time of need. Kevin assured me repeatedly that money wasn't a concern and I shouldn't worry about being a financial burden, said family took care of family in difficult times, and he was happy to help. His words felt genuine and loving when he said them, made me feel grateful that my son valued our relationship more than any inconvenience my care might cause. Sold my apartment and used some of the proceeds to pay Kevin for expected expenses. Gave him $10,000 up front for my share of household costs and any modifications needed for my accessibility. Moved into a small bedroom in Kevin's house that had been his home office. The space was adequate with a bed and dresser, but felt cramped and isolated from the main living areas. Kevin and his wife Jennifer had 2 teenage children. The house was busy and loud with normal family life that I tried not to disrupt with my presence. Started noticing within the first month that I was essentially invisible in their household. Would sit in the living room and family members would walk past without acknowledging me. Conversations would stop when I entered rooms. Ate most meals alone in my room because family dinners happened at times when I was resting or they'd forget to call me to the table. Would hear them laughing and talking while I ate reheated leftovers by myself. The isolation was profound, even though I was surrounded by people. Felt more alone living with family than I had in my own apartment. Kevin was always at work during the day. Jennifer and the kids were busy with their activities. Nobody seemed to have time or interest in spending time with the disabled old man in the back bedroom. My daily routine became monotonous and depressing. Would wake up and take my medications alone, eat breakfast alone, spend hours sitting in my room watching television or staring out the window. Physical therapy appointments were the only times I left the house. Kevin would drive me there and back in silence, clearly viewing it as an obligation rather than an opportunity to spend time together. Started to understand that Kevin's offer to care for me had been more about duty than actual desire to have me in his home. The care Kevin had promised when inviting me to move in never materialized beyond providing a room and occasional meals. Nobody helped me with tasks I struggled with. Nobody checked if I needed anything or was doing okay emotionally. Jennifer would do laundry for the family but skip my clothes, would cook dinner for everyone else but leave me to figure out my own food most nights. The kids treated me like furniture in their house, would walk into my room without knocking to retrieve things they'd stored there. Never asked about my day or my health. Realized slowly and painfully over those months that I'd become a burden they tolerated rather than a family member they valued. My presence in their home was accepted out of obligation, but resented in practice. Spent increasing amounts of time alone in my room because being around the family just highlighted how unwanted I was. How much my stroke and disability had made me a problem rather than a person. Kevin's resentment toward me became more obvious and harder to hide as the months of my living with them stretched on. The polite tolerance of my presence gradually transformed into open irritation and hostility. Every time I needed help with something, he'd sigh heavily and make comments about how much time he was spending on my care, how his own life was being disrupted by my constant needs. Asked him once to help me reach medications on a high shelf I couldn't access with my limited mobility. He complained loudly about having to stop what he was doing to help me with basic tasks I should be able to handle myself. Doctor appointments became major sources of conflict because Kevin had to take time off work to drive me, would complain the entire way there and back about losing money from missed work hours. Made it clear he was tracking every appointment and calculating the financial cost of my medical care. Would mention specific dollar amounts he was losing by taking me to see doctors. Started avoiding telling him about appointments I needed because his resentment and complaints made me feel guilty for having health problems that required ongoing medical attention. Every medication I took became something Kevin was aware of and annoyed by. He'd complain about the cost of prescriptions and question whether I really needed all the pills doctors had prescribed. Would suggest I should talk to doctors about cheaper alternatives or reducing dosages. Seemed more concerned about saving money than about my health and recovery. Made me feel like my medical needs were extravagant demands rather than legitimate requirements for someone recovering from a serious stroke. Jennifer was even worse about tracking costs and making sure I knew how much my presence was costing them financially. Would calculate grocery expenses loudly enough for me to hear. Would stand in the kitchen with receipts adding up costs while making comments about how much food prices had increased since I'd moved in. Once heard her tell Kevin that my meals were costing them about $12 daily. That added up to $360 monthly just to feed me. She'd do this calculation in front of me deliberately, wanted me to hear and feel guilty about eating food in their house. Would make comments while preparing meals about portion sizes and waste. Would serve me smaller portions than everyone else while explaining food was expensive and we couldn't afford to waste anything. Started eating less and skipping meals just to avoid being made to feel like a burden. Lost weight I couldn't afford to lose because I was already thin and weak from the stroke. The kids absorbed their parents' resentment and started treating me with similar contempt. Would complain about having to be quiet in the house because Grandpa was always resting. Made comments about their friends not being able to come over as much because there was a sick old man living there. Blamed me for changes in their lifestyle and freedom. Would walk past my room talking loudly about how they wished they had their dad's office back instead of it being Grandpa's bedroom. Kevin started making increasingly direct comments about my financial contributions. Would mention that the $10,000 I'd given them when moving in was long gone, and my presence was now costing them money they hadn't budgeted for. Would list expenses associated with me, including the extra utilities from my room, the increased water bill from my showers, the wear on his car from driving me places. Made me feel like every moment of my existence in their house was extracting value from them that I wasn't repaying. Every basic need I had became a burden they were sacrificing to meet. Every meal I ate was costing them money they were working hard to earn. Kevin would come home from work tired and immediately start complaining about how stressed he was from working to support everyone, including me. Would make comments about how much easier life was before I'd moved in. Jennifer would talk about things they couldn't afford anymore because they were supporting me. Would mention vacations they'd had to cancel or purchases they'd had to delay. The message was clear and constant that my existence in their home was a financial drain they resented. That I was taking resources away from the actual family members who deserved them. Started to feel like a thief living in their house, like my basic needs for food and shelter and medical care were selfish demands I had no right to make. Last Thursday evening, the family gathered for dinner around 7 as usual. Jennifer had made pasta with meat sauce and garlic bread, the kind of simple meal she typically prepared when she didn't feel like cooking anything elaborate. I came to the table slowly using my cane for support, sat in the chair they'd designated as mine at the far end, away from the family cluster. My hands were shaking worse than usual that day from fatigue and stress. The tremors from my stroke always got more pronounced when I was tired or anxious. Started eating my pasta carefully, trying to control the fork with my trembling left hand. The simple act of getting food from plate to mouth required intense concentration and took significantly longer than it used to before the stroke. Would get a few noodles onto the fork and slowly bring it up to my mouth. Some would fall off halfway, causing me to try again. The process that took normal people 5 minutes to complete took me 20 minutes or more. Every bite was a struggle against my body's limitations. Kevin sat across from me, eating quickly and efficiently like he always did, watched me struggle with my food while his expression grew darker and more contemptuous. Could feel his eyes on me, tracking every dropped noodle and every slow movement, his jaw clenching with visible irritation at how long I was taking. Jennifer and the kids ate in silence, the tension in the room growing thicker as my meal dragged on and everyone else had finished. I was about halfway through my plate after struggling for 20 minutes, my hand shaking so badly now that more food was ending up back on the plate than in my mouth. Kevin suddenly slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump, the sound echoing through the dining room as he stared at me with pure contempt in his eyes. His face was red with anger that had clearly been building while he watched me eat. His voice when he spoke was cold and cutting. He told me to stop eating. Just stop right now because I was wasting food I could barely even get to my mouth properly. Said every bite I took was costing him money he was working his ass off to earn, while I contributed absolutely nothing to the household. His words were sharp and deliberate, designed to hurt and humiliate me in front of his entire family. Told me I was pathetic sitting there struggling with basic tasks like eating, that watching me was embarrassing and painful. Jennifer nodded in agreement with everything Kevin was saying, added her own comments about how much food I wasted by dropping it or eating so slowly it got cold. The kids kept their eyes on their phones, pretending not to hear, but clearly listening to every word their father said to me. Kevin continued his rant, saying I was wasting food, wasting space in their house, wasting their time and resources that should go to the actual family members who mattered. Told me directly that I was a burden they couldn't afford anymore, that every meal I ate was taking food away from his children, that my medical needs were draining money they needed for important things. Said I contributed nothing except problems and expenses, that I'd become dead weight they were carrying out of obligation rather than love. His voice got louder as he listed all the ways my presence was damaging their family, all the sacrifices they were making to tolerate me in their home. Put down my fork mid-bite with hands shaking worse now from humiliation and shock than from the stroke. Couldn't believe my own son was screaming at me for eating dinner at his table. The pasta I'd been struggling to eat sat half-finished in front of me, every bite I'd managed suddenly feeling like theft given Kevin's words. My appetite was completely gone, replaced by crushing shame and the realization that I was genuinely unwanted in this house. The silence after Kevin's explosion was deafening. Nobody moved or spoke while his words hung in the air between us. Sat there at 76 years old being told by my own son that eating a plate of pasta was wasting his resources, that my basic need for food was a burden he couldn't tolerate. Something inside me broke in that moment, shattered under the weight of his contempt and cruelty. I sat frozen at that dinner table with my fork still in my trembling hand, couldn't process what my son had just said to me in front of his entire family. The half-eaten plate of pasta in front of me looked like evidence of my crime, proof that I was taking resources I had no right to consume. Kevin stared at me with undisguised contempt, waiting for me to respond or apologize or get up and leave, his face showing satisfaction that he'd finally said what he'd clearly been thinking for months. Jennifer nodded along with everything Kevin had said, added that she'd been keeping track of costs and my presence was genuinely affecting their family budget in ways they couldn't sustain. Said they'd tried to be patient and understanding about my situation, but there were limits to what they could sacrifice for someone who wasn't contributing anything. Her words were calmer than Kevin's but equally cruel, framed my existence as a mathematical problem rather than a father living with his son. The teenage kids continued staring at their phones, but I could see small smirks on their faces. They'd absorbed their parents' resentment and found entertainment in watching their grandfather be humiliated. This wasn't the first scene like this they'd witnessed, had become used to their parents complaining about me and treating me like a burden. My humiliation was just normal dinner table conversation in this house. Kevin continued his rant, saying I was wasting food with my slow eating and dropping half of what I tried to eat, that I was wasting the space of an entire room he needed for his office work. Said I was wasting their time driving me to appointments and helping me with tasks I should figure out how to do myself, despite my disabilities. Listed every way my presence was extracting value from their lives, every inconvenience and cost associated with keeping me in their home. Told me I was wasting resources they needed for their actual family, for his children's activities, and his wife's needs, and their plans for the future. Made it clear I wasn't included in his definition of actual family. I was an obligation and a burden, separate from the people who mattered. His voice, when he said actual family, emphasized that I'd been demoted from father to problem, from family member to unwanted guest, overstaying his welcome. Slowly put my fork down on the plate and pushed it away. Couldn't imagine taking another bite after being told so directly that eating was theft. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now from a combination of my stroke symptoms and the emotional trauma of what was happening. Felt tears starting to form, but refused to let them fall in front of people who'd enjoy seeing me cry. Wanted to defend myself or argue, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. Couldn't form words past the crushing shame and hurt. Kevin seemed to take my silence as agreement or submission, told me we'd need to have a serious conversation soon about my living situation because this arrangement wasn't working long term. Said they'd been generous letting me stay this long, but there were limits to family obligation, that maybe I needed to start looking into other options for care. The threat was clear that he was considering kicking me out, that my presence had become intolerable enough they were willing to make me leave. Nobody defended me or told Kevin he was being too harsh. Jennifer and the kids just accepted his words as reasonable and justified. Sat there at 76 years old with partial paralysis being told by my son that I was wasting his food and his space and his resources, that my basic existence was a burden he'd tolerated long enough. The man I'd raised and supported through his entire childhood was now calculating the cost of my meals and resenting every dollar spent, keeping me alive. That night after dinner, I went back to my small room and sat on the bed in darkness. Didn't turn on lights because even electricity felt like something I was stealing from them. Something inside me had broken during that dinner, but then reformed into something harder and colder, transformed the hurt and shame into determination to never be dependent on Kevin's resentment again. Started thinking about options I'd kept quiet about, resources I'd never mentioned because I'd never wanted to be the kind of father who bragged about money. What Kevin didn't know, because I'd never been the type to brag about money or display wealth, was that my modest savings of $40,000 weren't everything I had financially. Years ago, when I'd still been working and healthy, I'd established a trust with a financial advisor and attorney who managed investments I'd been building since my 30s. Had opened the trust accounts after my wife died, wanting to ensure I'd have resources for my own care in old age, never wanting to become a burden on my children if I lived long enough to need help. The trust had been funded initially with life insurance money from my wife's death and savings I'd accumulated over decades of working. Started with about $200,000 and instructions to the financial advisor to invest conservatively for long-term growth. Over the years, I'd added to it when I had extra money. Would put bonuses or tax refunds into the trust accounts instead of spending them. Never checked the balance frequently or paid much attention to the investments, just trusted the advisor to manage things properly. When I'd had my stroke 2 years ago and moved in with Kevin, I'd only told him about the $40,000 in my regular savings account, because that seemed like the appropriate amount to contribute toward my care. The trust accounts were managed separately by my attorney and financial advisor. Statements went to them rather than to me. Kevin had no knowledge they existed. Had always thought of the trust as emergency money for true crisis situations, something to access only when absolutely necessary. Never mentioned the trust to Kevin because I hadn't wanted him to view me as someone with significant assets. Didn't want money to be the reason he agreed to let me live with him. Wanted his offer of care to be based on love and family obligation rather than expectation of inheritance. Preferred he think I was modestly situated like most elderly people. The $40,000 I'd told him about seemed like enough to cover my expenses for a reasonable time without revealing the full extent of my resources. After that humiliating dinner where Kevin told me to stop eating, I lay in bed thinking about those trust accounts I'd almost forgotten existed. Called my attorney the next morning and asked him what the current balance was. Heard him tell me the conservative investments had grown substantially over the years. The trust now held nearly $800,000 in various stock and bond funds, money I'd accumulated without really tracking because I'd been healthy and independent for so long. My attorney asked if everything was okay and if I needed to access any of the funds, could hear concern in his voice because I'd never inquired about the trust balance before. Told him I was living with my son who was struggling with the financial burden of my care, asked what options I had for using the trust money to become independent again. He explained the trust was structured specifically to pay for my care and living expenses, that I could access as much as needed for housing or medical support. Started researching senior living facilities that night on my phone, looking for places that provided full care, including meals and medical support for people with my disabilities. Found several upscale communities that offered private apartments with assistance, chef-prepared meals, transportation to appointments, everything I needed to live independently without relying on Kevin's resentful charity. The costs were substantial, typically $6,000 to $8,000 monthly, but the trust had enough to cover several years of this level of care. Realized I'd been living like a burden dependent on Kevin's grudging support when I actually had the resources to live comfortably on my own terms, had enough money to buy independence and dignity rather than accepting humiliation. The $40,000 Kevin knew about had made me seem poor and dependent, but the $800,000 he didn't know about made me wealthy enough to escape his house and his contempt. The emergency I'd been saving for had arrived. My son telling me to stop eating because I was wasting his food qualified as exactly the kind of crisis the trust was meant to address. Made the decision that night lying in the darkness of Kevin's spare room that I'd use my money to leave his house and never return, would activate the trust and establish my own independent living situation where nobody calculated the cost of my meals. I woke up at 5 in the morning the day after that awful dinner, lay in bed for a few minutes making sure I was certain about the decision I'd made during the night. Knew that once I started this process, there would be no going back, that leaving Kevin's house would permanently damage our relationship in ways that couldn't be repaired. But remembering his face when he'd told me to stop eating, remembering the contempt in his voice when he'd called me a waste of resources, made the decision feel absolutely right. Called my attorney William at exactly 8 when his office opened, told him I needed to activate the trust immediately and use it to establish independent living arrangements. Explained briefly about my living situation with Kevin and that I needed to move out as soon as possible. Needed to find senior care facility that could accommodate me today, if possible. William's voice was professional, but I could hear surprise that I was making such sudden major changes. Asked if I was sure about moving so quickly without more planning. Told him I was completely certain and needed this to happen immediately, that every additional day living in Kevin's house was damaging to my dignity and well-being. William said he'd make calls to senior facilities he knew about and see what was available for immediate move-in, that he'd also arrange for movers to collect my belongings if needed. Asked me what my budget was for monthly care costs, and I told him to find the best facility available regardless of price. That I wanted a place that would treat me with dignity and provide excellent care. By 10 that morning, William called back with options, had found a luxury senior living community called Heritage Gardens that had a private apartment available immediately. The facility offered full-service care, including 3 chef-prepared meals daily, housekeeping, transportation, medical support, everything I needed. The cost was $8,000 monthly, which would give me approximately 8 years of care funded by the trust if I lived that long and didn't need additional medical expenses. Told William to secure the apartment immediately and arrange for my move-in that same day. Asked him to have the facility send someone to pick me up from Kevin's address. He arranged everything within 2 hours. Called back to say Heritage Gardens would have a driver at Kevin's house at noon to collect me and bring me to the facility. Said they'd provide furnished apartment initially, and I could arrange to get my belongings from Kevin's house later, that the priority was getting me into safe, comfortable housing today. Packed the few personal items I cared about into a small bag while Kevin was at work, and Jennifer was out running errands, moved slowly but deliberately collecting my medications and important documents. Looked around the small room that had been my prison for months, felt no sadness about leaving, just relief that I'd never have to sleep here again. Wrote a brief note on paper I found in the room and left it on the kitchen counter where Kevin would see it when he came home. The note was short and direct. Told Kevin he'd said I was wasting his food, so I was taking my waste elsewhere to a place where I could pay for my own meals. Wrote that he shouldn't try to contact me because I needed time away from people who measured my worth in grocery costs. Signed it simply with my name, no love or any terms of endearment, because the relationship we'd had was damaged beyond those words having meaning. The driver from Heritage Gardens arrived exactly at noon, a kind woman named Susan who helped me to her car with my bag and my cane. She didn't ask questions about why I was leaving or what had happened, just treated me with professional courtesy and respect. The drive to the facility took about 30 minutes. She pointed out features of the community as we approached, including the beautiful grounds and the various amenities available to residents. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, I was signing paperwork and getting keys to my private apartment at Heritage Gardens, a spacious studio with bathroom and sitting area that felt like luxury after months in Kevin's spare room. The staff welcomed me warmly and explained the meal times and services available, treated me like a valued resident rather than a burden being grudgingly tolerated. Kevin came home from work that Thursday evening around 6, expecting to find me in my room like usual, probably planned to ignore me or make more comments about my being a burden. Found my room empty with the bed made and my few belongings gone. Noticed immediately that something was different but probably assumed I was in the bathroom or somewhere else in the house. Started calling for me after a few minutes when I didn't appear, his voice getting more concerned as he searched the house and realized I genuinely wasn't there. Found my note on the kitchen counter where I'd left it next to his car keys, read the brief message explaining I'd left because he'd told me to stop eating and I was taking my waste elsewhere. Could imagine his face as he processed what had happened, the confusion about where I could possibly have gone and how I'd arranged it without his knowledge. Jennifer came home shortly after, and they both started trying to call my cell phone. Didn't realize I'd turned it off specifically to avoid their attempts to reach me. My phone recorded 17 missed calls from Kevin that first evening between 6 and midnight. Watched the notifications pile up on my screen without answering any of them. He left voicemails that I listened to later, his messages starting with confusion, asking where I was and if I was okay. The early voicemails sounded genuinely worried, like he was concerned something bad had happened to me, asking me to please call back so he knew I was safe. But as the evening progressed and I continued not answering, Kevin's voicemails shifted from worried to angry. Started leaving messages demanding I tell him where I'd gone, saying I couldn't just leave without discussing it properly with him. His tone suggested he viewed my departure as disobedient behavior rather than the justified escape it actually was. Treated me like a child who'd run away rather than an adult making decisions about my own life. The later voicemails became increasingly panicked as Kevin apparently started to worry about practical implications of my disappearance, asking questions about whether I was safe and how I was managing my medications and care needs. Could hear real concern entering his voice mixed with the anger. Probably realized he might actually be worried about my well-being, despite how terribly he'd treated me. Left messages saying we needed to talk about this like adults, that leaving without discussion was ridiculous and immature. Jennifer left several voicemails too with a completely different tone than she'd had at dinner, suddenly acting concerned about my welfare and saying they were worried sick about where I'd gone. Her messages talked about how they cared about me and just wanted to know I was safe. No mention of the food costs or burden calculations she'd been making constantly. The sudden shift from resentment to concern would have been touching if it wasn't so transparently motivated by panic about losing control. Didn't respond to any calls or messages that first night. Let them worry and wonder while I ate a delicious dinner in Heritage Gardens' dining room. The meal was prepared by an actual chef and served on real plates by friendly staff, included choices of entrees and sides that I selected based on my preferences. Ate slowly with my trembling hands without anyone watching or calculating costs. Every bite tasted better, knowing I was paying for it with my own money. 3 days passed with Kevin and Jennifer continuing to call and text constantly, their messages becoming more desperate as I maintained complete silence. They apparently tried calling hospitals and police to see if I'd been admitted anywhere or reported missing, were genuinely panicked about my whereabouts. But I had no legal obligation to tell them where I was. I was a competent adult who'd chosen to move to a new residence. On the 4th day, Kevin apparently managed to track me down somehow, possibly called my attorney or found Heritage Gardens through internet searches for senior facilities. Showed up at the facility demanding to see me, got stopped in the lobby by security staff who explained visitors needed permission from residents before being allowed upstairs. Watched on the lobby security monitor from my apartment as Kevin argued with the guard, could see his face red with anger and frustration at being denied access. Kevin managed to convince the security desk to call up to my apartment after spending 30 minutes in the lobby arguing and pleading. The guard explained someone claiming to be my son was downstairs and wanted to speak with me. Asked the guard to tell him I wasn't available and didn't want visitors. Heard Kevin shouting in the background that he wasn't leaving until I talked to him. Finally agreed to speak with him by phone through the security desk, but refused to let him come up to my apartment. Wanted the conversation to have barriers and witnesses. The guard transferred Kevin's call to my apartment phone. His voice came through frantic and emotional in ways I'd never heard before. Started talking immediately about how worried he'd been, how he and Jennifer had been searching everywhere for me, how relieved he was to finally know I was safe. Asked where I'd been and why I hadn't answered any of his calls. Said leaving without telling him was cruel and unnecessary. The audacity of him calling my departure cruel after telling me to stop eating was almost laughable. Let him talk for several minutes, listing all his concerns and complaints about my disappearance. Listened to him perform worry and care that hadn't been present when he'd been calculating my grocery costs. When he finally paused, waiting for my response, I spoke calmly and clearly about the situation. Told him I was living at Heritage Gardens now, a luxury senior living facility where I was paying $8,000 monthly for my care from accounts he didn't know I had. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. After I mentioned the $8,000 monthly and the accounts he didn't know about, could practically hear his brain processing this new information. Kevin started to speak, and then stopped several times, clearly trying to understand how I could afford such expensive care when he'd believed I only had $40,000 in savings. Asked directly how I was paying for this facility if I didn't have money, his tone shifting from concern to confusion. Explained to him calmly that I'd established trust accounts decades ago that had grown to nearly $800,000 through conservative investments, money he'd never known about because I'd never mentioned it. Told him the trust was specifically designed to pay for my care and living expenses, that I had plenty of resources to live independently without depending on his grudging charity. Could hear him breathing heavily on the phone as he calculated what this meant, his silence speaking volumes about his racing thoughts. Continued speaking before he could interrupt. Told him I was paying $8,000 monthly for my apartment and full care at Heritage Gardens. Said the facility provided 3 chef-prepared meals daily, and I was eating every single one of them without anyone telling me to stop or calculating what each bite cost. Explained that at $8,000 monthly, my trust would fund approximately 8 years of care, maybe less if I needed additional medical support, but plenty long enough for the rest of my life. Kevin's voice when he finally spoke was different. The panic had returned, but for completely different reasons than he'd been worried about before. Started stammering about how he hadn't known I had that kind of money, that if he'd understood my financial situation, things would have been different. Said we needed to talk seriously about this because there were better ways to handle my care than spending $8,000 monthly at a facility, that family care was always preferable and more economical. Told him directly that the $800,000 in my trust could have been his inheritance someday if he'd treated me with basic dignity and respect, that the money would have passed to him when I died. But he told me to stop eating because I was wasting his food, had calculated my meals at $12 daily like I was stealing from him. Said now I was spending his inheritance on myself at a facility where every meal cost $40 and I enjoyed every single bite. The realization of what he'd lost seemed to hit Kevin all at once. Could hear him starting to cry on the phone as he understood he'd driven away a father with nearly $1 million by being too cheap and cruel about grocery costs. Kevin started showing up at Heritage Gardens every few days trying to get past security to see me. Would arrive at different times hoping to catch a shift change or find a guard who didn't know he was banned from visiting. The security staff were excellent about protecting residents' wishes, would call up to my apartment every time he appeared, asking if I wanted to allow him access. Always told them no and watched on the security monitor as they escorted him back outside. Could see his frustration and desperation growing with each rejected visit attempt. He'd stand outside the building sometimes for hours, hoping I'd look out a window and see him, would hold his phone up showing he was calling me trying to get me to answer. Left voicemails every single day begging me to just talk to him for 5 minutes, saying we needed to work this out like family and that he was sorry for everything. His apologies rang hollow after months of treating me like a burden. Couldn't erase the memory of him telling me to stop eating with such contempt in his voice. Jennifer started calling too, with a completely different tone than she'd had when calculating my grocery costs, suddenly emotional and crying about how they'd made a terrible mistake. Left long voicemails about how stressed they'd been and hadn't meant the things they'd said, that family was more important than money, and they needed me back. The shift from resentment to desperation was transparently about the $800,000 they'd learned about, rather than genuine regret about their treatment of me. Kevin tried sending letters to Heritage Gardens that the staff delivered to my apartment, pages of handwritten apologies and explanations about financial stress and work pressure. Tried to justify his behavior by explaining how tight their budget had been, how worried he was about money constantly, how my needs had felt overwhelming. Never took real responsibility for choosing to be cruel rather than honest about his limitations, just made excuses about circumstances that had supposedly forced his hand. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after I'd left, I was sitting in the lobby reading when I heard a commotion at the entrance. Looked up to see Kevin had somehow gotten past the initial security checkpoint, was in the main lobby on his knees, literally begging the desk staff to let him see me. Security guards were approaching to remove him, but he was crying and pleading loud enough for everyone to hear, saying he just needed 5 minutes with his father to apologize properly. The scene was pathetic and manipulative, clearly designed to make me feel guilty or to embarrass me into seeing him by causing a public disturbance. Other residents were staring at the drama. Staff members looked uncomfortable with the situation. Got up and walked toward the lobby thinking I'd tell Kevin directly to leave and never come back, that his performance wasn't going to change my decision to cut him from my life. Kevin saw me approaching, and his face lit up with hope, started talking rapidly about how sorry he was and how much he'd learned from this experience. Said he understood now how badly he'd treated me, that he'd been wrong to focus on money instead of family, that he wanted another chance to be a better son. His words were probably rehearsed, delivered with emotion that looked genuine but felt calculated. Told him clearly in front of all the witnesses that he'd told me to stop eating because I was wasting his food, that he'd made me feel worthless and burdensome for having basic needs. Said I was now spending his inheritance on $8,000 monthly of excellent care at a facility where nobody calculated my meal costs. Explained that every $40 chef-prepared meal I ate here was worth more than the $12 pasta he'd begrudged me. Kevin started crying harder and begging me not to waste the family money on expensive care when he could provide everything I needed at home. The phrasing revealed his real concern. He didn't want me back because he loved me, but because watching me spend $8,000 monthly was costing him nearly $1 million in inheritance. Told security to remove him permanently from the visitor list and escort him off the property. Walked back to my apartment while he shouted apologies behind me. I live now in genuine comfort at Heritage Gardens that I denied myself for decades while raising Kevin and saving money for my future. Eat 3 chef-prepared meals daily in the beautiful dining room surrounded by other residents who treat me with dignity and respect. Breakfast typically includes fresh fruit and eggs prepared however I want them, real coffee and juice, pastries baked that morning by the facility's kitchen staff. Lunch offers choices of entrees and sides, soups and salads, desserts that change daily. Dinner is the most elaborate meal with multiple courses and wine available if residents want it. Every meal costs approximately $40 when I calculate the monthly fee divided by the number of meals provided. That's $120 daily just for food compared to the $12 Kevin had complained about. Eat slowly with my trembling hands without anyone watching or commenting. Take as long as I need to finish without feeling rushed or judged. Drop food sometimes because my coordination isn't perfect, but the staff just smile and help clean it up. Never make me feel embarrassed about my disabilities. The other residents have become friends in ways Kevin's family never were. We sit together at meals and talk about our lives and families, share stories and jokes and genuine companionship. Nobody here measures my worth by my medical needs or calculates what my existence costs them. We're all elderly people with various health issues living together with mutual respect. Some residents have children who visit regularly, bringing grandchildren. Others, like me, have complicated family situations we don't discuss in detail. My apartment is peaceful and comfortable with space for my belongings and privacy whenever I want it. Housekeeping staff clean weekly and change linens without me having to ask or feel grateful for basic services. Medical staff check on residents regularly, help manage medications and coordinate doctor appointments, provide transportation to medical visits. Everything I need is included in that $8,000 monthly. No hidden costs or surprise expenses or resentful family members calculating what I'm taking from them. Kevin still calls occasionally, leaving voicemails that I delete without listening to them. Still shows up at Heritage Gardens every few weeks trying to get past security. His persistence is motivated entirely by watching his inheritance disappear at $8,000 per month, doing the math and realizing that 8 years of this care will consume everything I've saved. The money he thought would be his is being spent on my comfort and dignity, every month reducing his eventual inheritance by the exact amount his cruelty cost him. Sometimes I see him outside the building when I'm sitting in the common areas, watch him through the windows standing on the sidewalk looking up at the building. He'll stand there for an hour or more, hoping to catch a glimpse of me, occasionally holding up his phone, trying to get me to answer his calls. The security staff are instructed to call police if he becomes a nuisance. He knows this and keeps his distance while still making his presence known. Jennifer sent a letter last week that actually got delivered to my apartment. Pages of apologies and explanations about how they'd been planning to use my inheritance to pay for the kids' college. Said they'd been counting on that money to secure their family's future, had made financial plans assuming I'd die soon and leave them $800,000. The honesty was almost refreshing, except it confirmed everything I'd suspected. They'd calculated my value in dollars and decided tolerating me was worth the eventual payoff. The $800,000 in my trust will likely last me 8 to 10 years at the current spending rate, will run out sometime in my mid-80s if I live that long. Kevin knows this timeline, probably has it calculated down to the month when my money runs out and he inherits whatever is left. But every meal I eat here brings that number lower. Every month of comfortable independent living costs him $8,000 he thought he'd inherit. Eat every bite of food served to me with genuine pleasure. Savor the taste, knowing it's costing Kevin his inheritance one $40 meal at a time. He told me to stop eating because I was wasting his food, so I stopped eating his food and started eating better food than he can afford while spending the money he wanted. Every bite tastes like justice and freedom and dignity he tried to take from me.